Ciao friends and welcome to a new video from SQL BI. In this video, I want to talk about Allselected, one of the most widely used functions in DAX. Allselected is extremely powerful and you can safely use in your reports, as you are probably already doing, but you need to follow the best practices. The best practice for Allselected is really simple. Never use Allselected from inside an iteration. If you do that, that's the perfect recipe for a disaster. Problems will arise and the numbers will be hard to understand. Whereas if you stay away from all selected used inside an iterator, then everything works fine and you can safely write your code using all selected. If you just want to follow best practices, that's it, end of the video, and you can start using all selected. But if you want to understand the details, we will need to go deeper. That requires us understanding first the two behaviors of all selected. All selected works in a way when it is used inside summaries columns, and it works in a different way using shadow filter context when it is used inside an iterator. Mixing the two techniques and the two behaviors is not going to produce good results. So in the video, I'm going to quickly introduce all selected, then we will see all selected in summaries columns, then all selected inside an iterator, understanding better how the function works, and finally I will show you when the problem arises, understanding exactly why the numbers are unexpected. With all that said, no further ado, let's look at the demos. Let's start understanding what Allselected does and why it is there. Well, imagine that I want to create a report like this one. I have a slicer that let me filter some brands, and then I slice by brand, I compute the sales amount and the percentage. Now, this percentage is the division of this amount by this amount, and this amount depends on the filter that is coming from the slicer. So, a slicer filters some brands and I want to compute the total. The code is straightforward and you probably already know how to write a piece of code like this. We divide the sales amount by calculate sales amount again using all selected product brand. What does all selected do? All selected returns the brands that have been selected from outside of the current visual. Because if you look at the cell, here I have a filter that says Contoso. But I don't want the total for Contoso, I want this total, which is not all the brands, but only the ones filtered by the brand. And that is exactly what Allselected does. Allselected restores the filter context that was active outside of the current visual. But if you think a bit about that, this is our human understanding of Allselected. We think in terms of visuals, slicers, but DAX does not contain any notion of a slicer. So how does the communication between Power BI and the DAX engine happens so that DAX knows about what is inside and what is outside of the current visual? In order to do that, we can just look at the query being generated to create this report. So we just enable performance analyzer. It's already enabled, so I just need to open it, clear everything, refresh the visual, and let's take a look at the matrix. Let me copy the query, and then I go in DAX Studio, and I paste the query here. The query is, as always happens, auto-generated, so it's not very easy to understand. I always like to simplify that a bit. So we move the filter where it is being used. We get rid of this stuff. And we put evaluate at the beginning. And let's get rid of these two. If I did everything correctly, now the code is formatted correctly. And you see we have summarized columns that groups by product brand, and it also produces a grand total row. And we have a filter. This 3000 is placing a filter, and that is the filter coming from the slicer with a selection of brands. Then we compute sales amount and the percentage, ordered by product brand. Let me add the definition of the measure at the beginning. Let's define the measure so we have the code handy. Let's format everything and run it. We have the grand total that is not interesting, so let's get rid of this roll up its subtotal, and we have only the values that we want to look at. And let's run it again. So the calculation is 36.52%. Let's take a look. It's 36.52%, so the numbers are correct. How does the engine compute this value? Well, Summarize columns starts iterating by brand using a filter. So Summarize column knows that there is a filter being set on the visual, and then Summarize column will need to compute the rows of the current visual. So it needs to do that by brand. This is the list of brands which are available. It iterates brand by brand, not because it's an iterator, it just scans brand by brand. Then it computes the sales amount, and finally computes the percentage, which internally calls Allselected. What does Allselected do in Summarize columns? It says, oh, you want Allselected product brand. So even though I'm computing the value for, let's say, Adventure Works, so the filter context includes only Adventure Works, I will restore the filter that was available outside that contains all the selected brands. So Summarize columns knows that these are the selected brands, and the behavior of Allselected in Summarize column is to remove any filter from the column that you specify, in our case it is a product brand, and restore the outer filter. It knows about the outer filter because we passed it as one of the arguments to Summarize column. It's one of the filters placed by Summarize columns. And this is how Summarize column knows about the visual filter context, the filter context active on the visual. What if there are no filters inside Summarize column? Well, in that case, Summarize column uses the outer filter. Indeed, we can change this code. And rather than placing the filter inside Summarize columns, we use Calculate table to place an outer filter, and we move the entire filter from Summarize columns to the outer Calculate. If I did everything correctly, I did. Now we have a Calculate table and Summarize column. Now, Summarize column does not have a filter inside, but the filter is placed outside of Summarize columns by Calculate table. So what does Summarize column do in this case? It doesn't have its own filter, but it can use the external one. So Allselected will remove the filter from the brand and restore the outer filter. If you look at here, it's 36.52%, and if I run it again, it is still 36.52%. If you're using Summarize columns, Allselected is kind of simple to use because Summarize column knows about its own filters and the external filters. However, Summarize column has not always been there, and Allselected has always been there. So Allselected has a different behavior if it is not used inside Summarize columns. And this behavior is based on shadow filter context. You actually don't need to learn everything about shadow filter context, just understand what they are and why you should stay away from them. Let's rewrite this code, this time without using Summarize columns, just using regular iterators. We can use add columns over the values of product brand, and we compute sales amount, percentage, and that's it. Just add column values. Now you see that Summarize columns is no longer part of my code. This means that Allselected will behave in a different way. If I run it, I still get 36.52%. So Allselected works even though Summarize columns is not there. But how does it work? Well, what happens is a bit more intricate. When you have an iterator, iterators start scanning a table, so they receive a table as their first argument. In this case, the table is values of product brand, and we know values of product brand includes these brands because of the outer filter created by Calculate table. So the iterator starts, and the first thing that it does it creates a shadow filter context. What is a shadow filter context? It's like a filter context, with the important difference that a shadow filter context is not active. It is not filtering anything. It stays there dormant until Allselected wakes it up. And the shadow filter context includes the table that is being iterated. This means that calculate table places the filter over the brand, add columns evaluates values of product brand, it retrieves a table containing these brands, and then starts iterating brand by brand. On every individual brand, it is calling a measure, percentage or sales amount. Therefore, context transition is happening, the current brand is part of the filter context, and when I finally compute sales amount, I compute the sales amount of the current brand. When this calculate is executed, it uses Allselected of a product brand. What does Allselected do? Allselected goes back to the shadow filter context and activates it. The shadow filter context includes the table being iterated, meaning that it includes a table containing these values. That is the reason why when this Allselected is executed, it replaces the filter over the brand with a filter containing all the brands being iterated. Keep that in mind, that is important. It does not restore the outer filter context. It restores a filter context that contains the brands that are being iterated. The result is the same if you write simple code like this. Indeed, you run it, it's still 36.52%. But you can notice the difference if, rather than iterating values of product brand, you scan all product brand. What's the difference here? The outer filter context is still the same, but now the table that I'm iterating does no longer contain only the brands that are selected from calculate table. Now it contains all the brands. So the shadow filter context includes all the brands, and when I execute it, this number for AdventureWorks will no longer be 36.52%. It will be smaller because Allselected restore a filter that contains all the brands. Let me run it, and AdventureWorks now shows 22.38%, so a much smaller value. This behavior, Allselected inside iterators, has been there because before summarize columns, it was the only way for DAX to understand what is the outer filter context. And Power BI generated queries that made sure that Allselected was safe. However, and that is the important thing, when Allselected is executed inside an iteration, it does not restore the outer filter context because there is no notion of outer filter context. It restores the filter context of the table that is being iterated. This is not so relevant to understand in full. It's just important to hear about that and to know that this behavior exists. Because nowadays, if you just rely on the behavior of Allselected inside summaries columns, you are happy and you are fine. But in order to make sure that your code works, you need to stay away from the behavior of Allselected with shadow filter context. That means you should never call a measure that uses Allselected from inside an iteration. And I want to show you what might happen if you just forget about that. So I have created a couple of measures, 3 measures actually. We have a measure, total sales, that computes sales amount for Allselected. So if I just take total sales and I drop it here, it shows the sales amount for Allselected. And if I change my selection, of course, all the numbers are going to change. So total sales computes that row total for the sales amount. And then I want to compute here. I want to compute the sales of relevant products. What do I mean by a product being relevant? The idea is that a product is considered relevant if it contributes to more than 0.5% of the total sales. So how do I compute this value? Well, I start iterating over the products, and I divide if the division of the sales amount by total sales, so the current sales amount of the sales amount of the current product divided by the total that has been selected, that is greater than 0.5%, then I return the sales amount. So this iteration scans product by product and it checks if the product is relevant, then I sum it. If it is not, I skip it. If I use the measure as it is, and I drop it here, let's get rid of this PCT, you see that it's weird. What makes this measure weird? Well, look at the total, that is 1.7 million, and we have 2 millions. So we have rows that are actually larger than the total, and this does not make a lot of sense. Besides, if you sum all the individual rows, you get a huge number that is actually probably greater than the total of the sales amount. I didn't check it. However, the problem is the measure is not working. There is a signal that tells us that the measure has a problem because we are calling a measure total sales, and we are doing that from inside an iteration of a product. So we are scanning product by product, and while scanning it, we are computing total sales. And it happens that total sales uses Allselected. If you want to make this measure work nicely, what you need to do is avoid using the measure using Allselected inside the iteration. We have the correct version of the relevant sales measure that is here. And you see that the only difference is that now I store in a variable total sales, and I compute total sales, the measure using Allselected, from outside of the iteration. Once I have computed it, I can start iterating over product, and I divide the sales amount by total sales. Be mindful, total sales does not depend from the iteration because it uses Allselected, so it restores the original filter context. If I use relevant sales correct in my matrix, the numbers are now correct. The total is the same, but now the total is the sum of the individual rows, and these values are correct. In order to understand what is happening, we need to go inside the code and look at some details. I'm not going to write the code because it takes forever, so I have already prepared a query that shows the problem. This query, let me run it, shows side by side by brand the sales amount, the wrong measure, and the correct measure. And we have comment to look at in order to understand what is happening. Remember, total sales is the measure that we're using that calls Allselected. And let's look at the wrong measure first. Summarize column groups by brand. We iterate by product. Now, when SumX starts iterating products, how many products will it see? If you're looking at Contoso, so you are currently computing the value for Contoso, SumX over product contains the Contoso product. So product contains the products of the current brand only. Inside this iteration, we are calling total sales. Total sales uses Allselected, and what is the table being restored by Allselected? It restores the product table that is currently being iterated. That is, the products of the current brand only. That is why this total sales is not the percentage of the grand total. It's the percentage against the products of the same brand. It's crazy, but that's exactly what the engine is computing, because it is using a shadow filter context, because we are calling Allselected from inside an iterator. Whereas if you use the version with the variable, when total sales is being called, there is no iteration happening. Therefore, my measure now relies on the summarize columns behavior, and when Allselected, this Allselected is being executed, summarize columns restores the outer filter, and the outer filter includes only the selection of the brand, producing a correct result. So the problem appears when you use Allselected, when you call a measure that includes Allselected. Therefore, the best practice is actually to use Allselected only as a top-level calculate modifiers for measures that are placed directly inside your report. And I got used to the habit of never call a measure that contains Allselected. Why that? Because if I call a measure and I know it contains Allselected, I might be aware of the problem and I might avoid calling it from inside an iteration. But maybe I write a measure and then somebody else calls this measure and then somebody else calls another measure, and that creates a chain of measures up to the point where you lose track of where Allselected is being used. So in order to avoid the problem entirely, if I need to use Allselected, I place it in a measure and I know that that measure will go directly in a matrix. I never call that measure to avoid any problem. As you have seen, Allselected is powerful. It's simple to use, it works nicely, but the thing is, if you use it in summarized columns, it has the expected behavior. If you use it from inside an iterator, then problems start to appear and you might be in trouble. Therefore, if you want to avoid problems, just follow the best practice. Never use Allselected from inside an iteration. And if you really want to stay on the safe side, never call a measure if that measure includes Allselected, because you don't know if somebody might start an iteration before your own measure. So, you want to stay safe, use Allselected only as the top-level filter for measure directly used in a matrix. Enjoy DAX!